When I collapsed from chest pains at 2 a.m., Frederick rushed me to Mercy General Hospital, promising he'd stay until the doctors figured out what was wrong. 3 hours later, he got a phone call and suddenly had a family emergency that couldn't wait. He needed to help his wife Kiana move furniture before her morning shift. That same night, Kiana posted photos on social media showing them laughing at a late-night diner. The caption reading, "When your husband drops everything to make sure you're taken care of, you know you married the right one." Everyone who saw that post knew exactly who she was targeting. Me, the mother-in-law sitting alone in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm. But what Frederick didn't know was that I had already made a very different decision about my will earlier that week. And what happened next would change our family forever. This is the story of how I discovered my real worth and why I left my entire inheritance to someone who actually deserved it, his ex-wife, Aaliyah Cooper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The pain hit me like lightning at exactly 2:17 a.m. I remember looking at the clock on my nightstand as I clutched my chest, gasping for air. For a moment, I thought this might be it, the end of everything. At 73 years old, you don't take chest pains lightly, especially when they're accompanied by that crushing sensation that feels like an elephant sitting on your ribcage. Managed to reach for my phone with trembling fingers and called Frederick. My son answered on the third ring, his voice groggy but immediately alert when he heard my labored breathing. "Mom? What's wrong?" "Frederick, I think I'm having a heart attack," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I need to get to the hospital. I'm on my way. Don't move, don't do anything. I'll be there in 15 minutes. For once in the past 2 years since he'd married Kiana, Frederick sounded like the concerned son I remembered from his younger years. The boy who used to check on me when I had so much as a common cold, who would bring me soup and stay home from school if I needed him. That Frederick seemed to have vanished the moment he said "I do" to his second wife. True to his word, he arrived. In 12 minutes, I could hear his key in the lock, his hurried footsteps down the hallway to my bedroom. "Mom, how are you feeling? Can you walk?" His face was pale with worry as he helped me sit up slowly. "Better now that you're here," I admitted. The pain had subsided somewhat, but I could still feel that uncomfortable pressure in my chest. "I think we should go to Mercy General." Frederick nodded, grabbing my purse and helping me into my robe. "Of course. Let me help you to the car." The drive to Mercy General Hospital was mostly silent except for Frederick asking me repeatedly how I was feeling. He kept glancing over at me with genuine concern, and for those 20 minutes, I felt like I had my son back. The Frederick who used to call me every Sunday without fail, who remembered my birthday without prompting, who actually seemed to enjoy spending time with his mother. At the hospital, Frederick was everything a devoted son should be. He helped me fill out the paperwork, stayed with me during the initial examination, and held my hand while we waited for the test results. The emergency room doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, ran an EKG, took blood samples, and ordered a chest X-ray. "Mrs. Graham," Dr. Martinez said, returning with my chart, "the good news is that you haven't had a heart attack. However, you're showing signs of severe stress and your blood pressure is quite elevated. I'd like to keep you for observation overnight and run a few more tests in the morning to rule out any underlying cardiac issues." Frederick squeezed my hand. "Whatever you think is best, doctor. I'll stay with her." Those were the words that I would replay in my mind countless times over the following weeks. I'll stay with her. Simple, straightforward, the kind of thing any devoted son would say when his mother was lying in a hospital bed, uncertain about her health. The nurse, a young man named Caleb, got me settled into a room on the cardiac unit. It was around 5:30 a.m. by then, and I was exhausted. Frederick pulled the uncomfortable-looking chair closer to my bed and sat down. "Try to get some rest, Mom. I'm not going anywhere." I felt tears of gratitude well up in my eyes. Thank you, sweetheart. I know Kiana probably isn't happy about you being here all night. Frederick's expression tightened slightly at the mention of his wife's name. She understands. Family comes first. I drifted off to sleep, feeling more secure than I had in months. My son was by my side, just like the old days. Maybe Kiana's possessiveness and constant demands on his time hadn't completely destroyed the bond we used to share. Maybe there was hope for rebuilding our relationship. I woke up around 8 a.m. to the sound of Frederick's phone buzzing insistently. He answered it quietly, stepping into the hallway so as not to disturb me, but I could hear his hushed conversation through the partially open door. I know. But she's in the hospital. Yes, I remember what day it is. Look, can't you ask Lemuel to help you? He's got a truck. What do you mean he's busy? When he came back into the room, his entire demeanor had changed. The worried, attentive son from a few hours earlier had been replaced by someone who looked anxious and distracted. He kept checking his phone and glancing toward the door. Everything okay? I asked, though I already suspected what was happening. Yeah, it's just... Kiana needs help moving some furniture today before her shift starts at noon. She's been planning this for weeks, and the rental truck is only available until 10 this morning. I felt my heart sink, but I tried to keep my voice neutral. That's quite early for moving furniture. I know, it sounds weird, but she got a good deal on the truck. Rental if she returned it by 10. She's moving some things from her mother's storage unit to our garage. Frederick was talking faster now, the way he always did when he was trying to justify something he knew was wrong. I see. And she can't handle this on her own? Mom, you know Kiana isn't very strong, and some of these pieces are really heavy. Her mother's antique dresser, a bookshelf, boxes of family photos. She really needs someone to help her. I looked at my son, really looked at him. This was a 35-year-old man sitting in a hospital room with his mother who had just spent the night thinking she might be having a heart attack, and he was seriously considering leaving to help his wife move furniture. Frederick, I said quietly, I'm still waiting for more test results. The doctor said she wanted to run additional tests this morning. I know, and I feel terrible about the timing. But honestly, Mom, you look so much better now. The doctor said it wasn't a heart attack, right? And you're in good hands here with the nurses. There it was. The moment when I realized that my son had already made his choice, and it wasn't me. The doctor said they needed to rule out underlying cardiac issues, I reminded him. That doesn't sound like something to take lightly. Frederick's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and his jaw tightened. Mom, I'm really torn here. Kiana she's really stressed about this move. And if I don't help her today, she'll have to pay another $100 for the truck rental tomorrow. Plus, she'll miss her shift at the clinic. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling a familiar heaviness in my chest. Not physical this time, but emotional. This was the same pattern that had been repeating itself ever since Frederick married Kiana 2 years ago. Every family gathering, every holiday, every important moment had been overshadowed by Kiana's needs, Kiana's schedule, Kiana's emergencies. When I opened my eyes, Frederick was studying my face with what looked like genuine conflict. For just a moment, I thought he might choose to stay. You know what? I said, forcing a smile. You should go help Kiana. I'll be fine here. The relief that flooded Frederick's face told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. Are you sure, Mom? I don't want you to think I'm abandoning you, but that's exactly what he was doing, and we both knew it. I'm sure. Family emergencies come up, right? I understand. Frederick stood up and leaned over to kiss my forehead. I'll call you as soon as I'm done helping her, okay? And I'll come back this afternoon to pick you up when they discharge you. Sounds good, sweetheart. And with that, my son walked out of my hospital room, leaving me alone with my IV drip and my growing realization that I had been fooling myself about our relationship for far too long. What I didn't know was that within hours, Kiana would post those photos of them laughing at Ruby's all-night diner, making it clear to anyone who cared to look that this emergency furniture move had been nothing more than an excuse to prioritize his wife's wants over his mother's needs. But what neither of them knew was that this moment would become the catalyst for a decision that would change everything. A decision about my will that I had been considering for weeks, and that Frederick's actions that morning would make final and irreversible. After Frederick left, the silence in my hospital room felt deafening. The steady beep of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of nurses chatting at their stations seemed amplified in the emptiness he had left behind. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to process what had just happened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My son, my only offspring, the boy I had raised alone after his father died when Frederick was just 12, had abandoned me in a hospital bed to help his wife move furniture. The rational part of my mind kept trying to make excuses for him. Maybe it really was an emergency. Maybe Kiana truly couldn't handle it alone. Maybe I was being overly sensitive because I was stressed and tired. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen this pattern emerging over the past 2 years, ever since Frederick married Kiana Fisher at the courthouse, in what he called an intimate ceremony. By intimate, he meant that I wasn't invited. Kiana had insisted it should be just immediate family, which apparently didn't include the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise Frederick as a single mother. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. After all, the doctor had confirmed I hadn't had a heart attack. Maybe Frederick was right. Maybe I was in good hands with the hospital staff, and there wasn't really anything he could do by sitting beside my bed. Maybe helping Kiana was genuinely more urgent. Even as these thoughts crossed my mind, I knew I was grasping at straws. The Frederick I had raised would never have left his mother alone in a hospital, regardless of the circumstances. The Frederick I remembered would have told Kiana that her furniture could wait until his mother was safely home and healthy. Around 10 a.m., Caleb, the nurse, came in to check my vitals and noticed that I seemed upset. "Everything all right, Mrs. Graham? You look like you might be in some discomfort. Are you experiencing any chest pain?" "No physical pain," I said quietly. "My son had to leave for a family emergency." Caleb raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I suspected he had seen this scenario play out before. Family members who showed up during the crisis, but disappeared once it was clear the patient wasn't dying. Well, the good news is that Dr. Martinez will be making rounds in about an hour, and if your blood work looks good, you might be able to go home this afternoon, he said kindly. "Is there someone else you can call to pick you up?" The question hit me harder than it should have. Who could I call? My sister Millie lived 3 states away and had her own health issues. My closest friend, Daisy Clark, was dealing with her husband's dementia and couldn't drive long distances anymore. Most of my other friends were either dealing with their own health problems or had family obligations. "My son said he'd be back this afternoon," I replied, though even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. "Of course," Caleb said with professional cheerfulness. "I'm sure he'll be here. In the meantime, try to get some rest." After he left, I found myself staring out the window at the parking lot below. I watched cars come and go, visitors arriving to see their loved ones, and I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of loneliness. Here I was, 73 years old, lying in a hospital bed, and the person I had expected to depend on had chosen to prioritize someone else's convenience over my well-being. I thought about Frederick's first marriage to Aaliyah Cooper. That had been a real wedding. A beautiful ceremony at St. Mark's Chapel with me in the front row, proud as could be. Aaliyah had been everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law. She was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely seemed to care about family relationships. She would call me every week just to chat, remembered my birthday with handmade cards, and always insisted that Frederick and I spend quality time together. During the 5 years Frederick was married to Aaliyah, our mother-son relationship had actually grown stronger. She encouraged him to take me on weekend trips, to call me more often, and to include me in their holiday plans. When I had surgery to remove my gallbladder 3 years ago, Aaliyah had taken a week off work to help care for me, cooking meals, and making sure I took my medications on schedule. The contrast with Kiana couldn't have been more stark. From the moment Frederick started dating her, she had systematically worked to distance him from me. She would schedule couples activities during our traditional Sunday dinners, plan elaborate date nights on my birthday, and constantly manufacture crises that required Frederick's immediate attention whenever he and I had plans. I had tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I understood that being a second wife couldn't be easy, especially when the first wife had been so beloved by the family. But Kiana's behavior went beyond normal adjustment difficulties. She seemed to view my relationship with Frederick as a threat to be eliminated rather than a bond to be respected. The irony was that Aaliyah had never seen me as competition. She had embraced our close relationship and even strengthened it. When Frederick forgot my birthday one year, Aaliyah had quietly reminded him and helped him plan a surprise dinner that meant more to me than he ever knew. When I was feeling lonely, after retiring from my job at the library, Aaliyah had suggested that Frederick and I start a weekly tradition of watching old movies together. But Aaliyah was gone now, remarried to a man named Ronald Wright who clearly adored her. I had seen them together at the grocery store a few months ago, and the way he looked at her with such obvious affection had made my heart ache, not for myself, but for Frederick. He had lost someone truly special when their marriage fell apart, and he didn't even seem to realize it. The marriage had ended not because of any dramatic betrayal or incompatibility, but because Frederick had gotten restless. He started talking about needing space to figure himself out and wondering if he had settled down too young. Aaliyah, being the gracious person she was, had agreed to a trial separation that eventually became a divorce. She had never said a harsh word about Frederick, even during the most difficult parts of their split. Looking back now, I wondered if Frederick's restlessness had been less about personal growth and more about his attraction to the chaos and drama that Kiana brought into his life. Where Aaliyah had been stable and nurturing, Kiana was unpredictable and demanding. Where Aaliyah had encouraged Frederick's better qualities, Kiana seemed to bring out his selfishness and inability to prioritize others' needs. Around 11:30 a.m., my phone rang. For a moment, my heart lifted, thinking it might be Frederick calling to check on me. Instead, it was an automated reminder about my upcoming dentist appointment. The disappointment was almost comical. Here I was, a grown woman, waiting for her adult son to call like some lovesick teenager. That's when I realized how pathetic I had become. I was lying in a hospital bed, making excuses for someone who had clearly shown me where I stood in his list of priorities. I was wasting emotional energy hoping for consideration that wasn't coming, and it needed to stop. I reached for my phone and opened my social media app, something I rarely did. I usually found it depressing to see everyone's carefully curated highlights, but today I felt compelled to look. It didn't take long to find what I was dreading. Kiana had posted 3 photos from what she was calling her unexpected adventure day. The first showed her and Frederick loading a dresser into a rental truck, both smiling broadly. The second was a selfie of them at Ruby's all-night diner, sharing what looked like a stack of pancakes. The third was a photo of Frederick carrying Kiana piggyback style in what appeared to be an empty parking lot, both of them laughing hysterically. The caption read, "When your husband drops everything to make sure you're taken care of, you know. You married the right one. Some people talk about love, but real love is shown through actions. So grateful for a man who always puts his family first. Real love, family first. Lucky wife." The post had been made at 9:47 a.m., less than 2 hours after Frederick had left my hospital bedside, claiming he needed to help with an urgent furniture emergency. I stared at that caption for a long time, particularly the phrase, "always puts his family first." Either Kiana was completely delusional about what constituted family priorities, or she was deliberately mocking me. Given what I knew about her personality, I suspected it was the latter. But instead of feeling angry or hurt, I felt something unexpected: clarity. This wasn't about furniture, and it never had been. This was about Frederick making a choice between his mother's well-being and his wife's desires, and he had chosen his wife. The social media post wasn't accidental. It was a declaration. Kiana was publicly claiming victory in a contest I hadn't even realized I was losing. For the first time since Frederick had walked out of my hospital room, I felt completely calm. The fog of confusion and self-doubt lifted, and I saw my situation with perfect clarity. My son had shown me exactly who he was and what I meant to him. Now it was time for me to decide what I was going to do about it. Dr. Martinez came by around 1 p.m. with my test results and discharge papers. My blood work was normal. My EKG showed no signs of heart damage, and my blood pressure had stabilized overnight. She prescribed a mild medication for anxiety and stress, and recommended I follow up with my primary care physician within the week. "You're free to go, Mrs. Graham," she said with a warm smile. "Do you have someone coming to pick you up?" "My son should be here soon," I replied, though I was beginning to doubt that was true. It was 2:30 p.m. when Frederick finally called. I had been sitting in the discharge waiting area for over an hour, watching other patients get picked up by their families, when my phone finally rang. "Mom, how are you feeling? I'm so sorry I'm running late. The furniture move took way longer than expected." His voice had that overly cheerful tone that people use when they know they've done something wrong but are hoping to gloss over it with enthusiasm. I recognized it from his teenage years when he would come home past curfew and try to distract me with animated stories about his evening. "I'm fine, Frederick. The doctor discharged me over an hour ago." "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm on my way right now. I should be there in about 20 minutes. I waited for him to explain what had taken so long, or to acknowledge that leaving me alone in the hospital might have been problematic. Instead, there was just an awkward silence. "Okay," I said, simply. "I'll be in the main lobby." "Great. And Mom, I brought you something to make up for this morning." When Frederick finally arrived at 3:15 p.m., he rushed through the lobby doors carrying a large bouquet of grocery store flowers and wearing what I had come to think of as his apologetic son expression. It was the same look he had given me countless times over the past 2 years when Kiana's needs had interfered with our plans. "Mom, there you are. I'm so sorry about the delay." He leaned down to hug me and thrust the flowers into my hands. "These are for you. I know how much you love daisies." I looked down at the bouquet. They were carnations, not daisies. Carnations had always reminded me of funeral arrangements, and Frederick knew I didn't care for them. But I accepted them graciously, as I always did. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're lovely." As we walked to his car, Frederick launched into what sounded like a carefully prepared explanation. "I really am sorry about this morning, Mom. When I left here, I thought the furniture move would take maybe 2 hours, tops. But when we got to Kiana's mother's storage unit, it was a complete disaster. Apparently, her mom had been throwing things in there for years without any organization. We had to move about 50 boxes just to get to the furniture we actually needed." I listened without comment as he helped me into the passenger seat and loaded my overnight bag into the trunk. "And then," he continued as he started the car, "the rental truck had some kind of mechanical problem. The back door wouldn't latch properly, so we had to drive really slowly and stop every few miles to make sure nothing fell out. What should have been a 30-minute drive to our place took over 2 hours. Frederick was talking faster now, the way he always did when he was building up to the part of the story he thought would justify everything else. But here's the crazy part. When we finally got to our house, we discovered that the dresser wouldn't fit through our garage door. Can you believe that? Kiana had measured the dresser but forgot to measure the door frame. So we had to drive all the way back to the storage facility and put it back, which meant another round trip with the broken truck. I found myself wondering if Frederick actually believed this elaborate story, or if he knew I would see right through it. The details were too convenient, too perfectly designed to explain away an entire day of absence. That sounds very frustrating, I said neutrally. It was! And the worst part was that Kiana was getting really upset about the whole thing. You know how she gets when plans don't work out. She started crying in the storage facility parking lot, saying she felt terrible that this was taking so long and that I was missing time with you. This was a new addition to Frederick's usual repertoire of excuses. Now Kiana was supposedly feeling guilty about monopolizing his time. It was almost insulting in its obviousness. I see. And how is Kiana feeling now? Oh, she's much better. She felt so bad about the whole situation that she insisted I stop and get you flowers. She said she hoped you weren't too upset with us. I almost laughed at the audacity of it. Not only was Frederick expecting me to believe his elaborate furniture story, but now he was attributing the gesture of buying me flowers to Kiana's thoughtfulness. That was considerate of her, I managed to say. She really is thoughtful, Mom. I know you two haven't had much chance to get to know each other, but Kiana really does care about family. She was genuinely worried about you last night. So worried that she had posted those cheerful photos of their impromptu date, but I kept that observation to myself. When we reached my house, Frederick insisted on walking me to the door and checking, to make sure I had everything I needed. He opened my refrigerator and noted that I was low on milk and eggs. I should go grocery shopping for you, he said. You shouldn't be driving today after everything you've been through. That's not necessary, Frederick. I feel fine. Are you sure? I don't mind. I could pick up whatever you need and have it back here in an hour. For a moment, I was touched by his offer. Maybe he really was feeling guilty about abandoning me at the hospital. Maybe this was his way of trying to make amends. Then my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it automatically and saw it was from Kiana. Is Frederick still at his mom's? We're supposed to meet Lemuel and Quinn for dinner at 6, and I need time to get ready. Frederick's phone buzzed at almost the same moment. He glanced at it, and his expression shifted slightly. Actually, Mom, maybe I should do the grocery run tomorrow instead. I just remembered that Kiana and I have dinner plans tonight that we made weeks ago. It's with some friends we haven't seen in a while, and it would be really awkward to cancel at the last minute. And there it was. The real Frederick, emerging from behind the facade of concerned son. His offer to help with groceries had been genuine in the moment, but the second Kiana's text arrived, his priorities rearranged themselves with predictable efficiency. Of course, I said. You should keep your dinner plans. I knew you'd understand. You're the best, Mom. He kissed my cheek and headed toward the door. I'll call you tomorrow to check on you, okay? That sounds fine. After he left, I sat down in my living room and looked at the carnations he had brought me. The whole afternoon had been an exercise in manipulation disguised as concern. Frederick had shown up late with grocery store flowers, delivered an implausible explanation for his absence, attributed his gesture to his wife's thoughtfulness, offered help he had no intention of providing, and then rushed off to dinner with friends. But the most insulting part wasn't the transparent lies or the hollow gestures. It was the assumption that I would accept all of it without question, that I would play along with the charade of being a grateful mother who understood that his wife's needs would always come first. I thought about all the times over the past 2 years when I had done exactly that, accepted his excuses, pretended to understand his priorities, and maintained the fiction that everything was fine between us. I had been so desperate to preserve our relationship that I had allowed it to become completely one-sided. Frederick had learned that he could treat me poorly without consequences. He could abandon me in a hospital, lie about his reasons, show up hours late with insincere gestures, and expect me to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he was willing to provide. The most damning part was that his behavior wasn't even malicious. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply didn't think my feelings mattered enough to consider. In his mind, I was supposed to be understanding and accommodating, regardless of how I was treated. That was my role in his life. The endlessly patient mother who never complained and never made demands. But as I sat there looking at those carnations, I realized that I was done playing that role. Frederick had made his choice about what kind of relationship he wanted with me, and now it was my turn to make some choices of my own. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Harold Goldstein, the attorney, who had handled my late husband's estate and had been encouraging me for months to update my own will. It was time to make that call. Before I called Harold, I found myself sitting in my kitchen, staring at those carnations and thinking about how we had gotten to this point. The hospital incident wasn't an anomaly. It was just the latest in a long series of moments when Frederick had chosen Kiana's convenience over our relationship. I remembered the first time it happened, about 6 months after they got married. It was my 71st birthday, and Frederick had promised to take me to lunch at Riverside Cafe, a little place where we used to go when he was younger. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, even bought a new dress for the occasion. That morning, he called to say he'd have to postpone because Kiana had woken up with what she called one of her migraines and needed him to drive her to her mother's house in Millbrook, a 2-hour round trip. She couldn't drive herself, Frederick explained, because the medication made her too drowsy. "We can do lunch next week instead," he had said, as if my birthday was a flexible event that could be rescheduled for his convenience. I had said it was fine, of course. I always said it was fine. But when I drove past their house that afternoon to drop off his birthday gift, a photo album I had been putting together for months, I saw both their cars in the driveway. Kiana was outside in the garden, looking perfectly healthy as she planted flowers. She waved at me cheerfully, apparently having made a miraculous recovery from her debilitating migraine. When I confronted Frederick about it later, he had an explanation ready. Kiana's mother had come to pick her up instead, he said, and then had decided to stay and help with some gardening. The migraine medication had worn off by then. It all made perfect sense, according to Frederick. That was when I first noticed his new talent for elaborate explanations that accounted for every inconsistency while missing the larger point entirely. Then, there was last Thanksgiving. I had been hosting family dinners for over 30 years, and Frederick knew how important the tradition was to me. We had planned the menu together, and he had promised to arrive by 2 p.m. to help with the final preparations. At 1:45, he called to say there was a kitchen emergency at their house. Kiana had been trying to make a side dish to bring to dinner, and their oven had malfunctioned, filling the kitchen with smoke. They needed to wait for a repair technician who was coming any minute now. I waited until 4 p.m. before starting dinner without them. The turkey was overcooked, the vegetables were cold, and I ate alone while looking at the place settings I had carefully arranged for 3 people. Frederick and Kiana finally arrived at 6:30 p.m., just as I was putting away the leftovers. Kiana apologized profusely, explaining that the repair technician had been delayed, then delayed again, and they simply couldn't leave until the kitchen was safe. But when they walked in, Kiana was carrying a store-bought pie instead of the homemade side dish she had supposedly been preparing when the oven broke. When I asked about it, she laughed and said, "Oh, I gave up on cooking after all that drama. Sometimes it's easier to just buy something, you know?" Frederick had nodded along as if this made perfect sense, as if spending 3 hours waiting for an oven repair and then buying a pie was a reasonable sequence of events that had nothing to do with prioritizing their own convenience over my feelings. The pattern became even clearer when I started paying attention to Frederick's social media activity. I had never been much for those platforms, but after the birthday incident, I began checking occasionally just to see what was happening in my son's life. I discovered that Frederick and Kiana had a very active social life that I knew nothing about. There were photos from weekend trips to the mountains, dinners at expensive restaurants, concerts and festivals, visits with Kiana's extended family. They seemed to have endless time for entertainment and spontaneous adventures. But every time I suggested we spend time together, there was always some obstacle. Frederick was too busy with work. Kiana wasn't feeling well. They had prior commitments, or there was some household crisis that required immediate attention. I started to realize that I only heard from Frederick when he needed something. Help with moving furniture, a ride to the auto shop when his car was being repaired, money to cover an unexpected expense. Our relationship had become purely transactional, and I had somehow agreed to a transaction where I provided support and understanding while receiving nothing in return. The most painful example had been last Christmas. Frederick and Kiana had decided to spend the holiday with her family in Sacramento, a decision that was presented to me as if I had no choice in the matter. Kiana's grandmother is 94 and probably won't be around much longer, Frederick had explained. This might be her last Christmas, so it's really important that we're there. I had spent Christmas alone for the first time since Frederick was born, eating a microwave dinner and watching old movies while my son posted photos of himself laughing with Kiana's relatives around a massive dinner table. But what made it worse was that I found out later from Daisy Clark, whose daughter lived in Sacramento, that Kiana's grandmother was in perfect health and had been hosting Christmas dinner for years. This wasn't a last-chance family gathering. It was just their normal family tradition, one that Frederick had chosen to join instead of maintaining his own. When I asked Frederick about it afterward, he seemed genuinely confused by my hurt feelings. "Mom, I told you we were going to Sacramento for Christmas. You said you understood." I said I understood that you wanted to spend time with Kiana's family. I didn't realize that meant you wouldn't spend any time with your own family. But we're all family now, he had replied, as if that explained everything. Kiana's family is my family too. Apparently, the definition of family extended to include Kiana's relatives, but somehow excluded his own mother. I began to see how skillfully Kiana had maneuvered Frederick away from me. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. There were no direct confrontations or ultimatums. Instead, she had created a steady stream of needs, emergencies, and obligations that always seemed to coincide with our plans. Every time Frederick and I scheduled something together, Kiana would develop a health issue, have a work crisis, or discover an urgent household problem that required his immediate attention. And Frederick, either too naive to see the pattern or too conflict-averse to acknowledge it, always chose to be the helpful husband rather than the faithful son. The genius of Kiana's approach was that it made Frederick feel noble and caring. He wasn't abandoning his mother. He was being a devoted husband who took care of his wife's needs. He wasn't choosing sides. He was simply responding to emergencies as they arose. But emergencies that happen every time you have plans with someone else aren't really emergencies. They're manipulations. I thought about Aaliyah and how different things had been during those 5 years. Aaliyah had never needed Frederick to abandon me for mysterious furniture moves or kitchen emergencies. She had never developed convenient migraines on my birthday or insisted that he choose between his wife's needs and his mother's feelings. Instead, Aaliyah had actively encouraged our relationship. She would suggest activities that Frederick and I could do together, remind him about important dates, and even plan special occasions that included all three of us. She understood that a man's relationship with his mother wasn't a threat to his marriage, it was an asset. But more than that, Aaliyah had genuinely liked me. She had enjoyed our conversations, appreciated my stories about Frederick's younger years, and seemed to find value in having me as part of her extended family. With Aaliyah, I had felt like I was gaining a daughter, not losing a son. The contrast was so stark that it made Frederick's current behavior even more painful. I knew he was capable of maintaining both relationships because he had done it successfully for 5 years. His current inability to balance his roles as husband and son wasn't a character flaw. It was a choice. as I sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence of my empty house, I realized that I had been enabling Frederick's behavior by accepting it without consequence. Every time I said it's fine when he canceled our plans, every time I pretended to understand his elaborate excuses, every time I acted grateful for whatever minimal attention he was willing to provide, I was teaching him that my feelings didn't matter. I had been so afraid of losing him completely that I had allowed our relationship to become something that wasn't worth keeping. But sitting there that evening, staring at those carnations that weren't even my favorite flower, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't angry, exactly. Anger implied that I still had expectations that could be disappointed. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity and resolve. Frederick had shown me over and over again what I meant to him. Now it was time to show him what his behavior meant to me. I picked up my phone and dialed Harold Goldstein's number. Harold answered on the second ring, his familiar voice warm and professional. "Anna, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you feeling? I heard through the grapevine that you had a bit of a health scare." News traveled fast in our small community, especially when it involved a trip to the emergency room. I wasn't surprised. That Harold had already heard about my hospital visit. "I'm fine, Harold. Much better, actually. But the experience got me thinking about something we discussed a few months ago. Your will. I was wondering when you'd be ready to make those changes. Would you like to schedule an appointment to discuss your options?" "Actually, I think I've already decided what I want to do. But yes, I'd like to meet as soon as possible to make it official." We scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday, and after I hung up, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in months, I was taking action instead of simply reacting to Frederick's choices. The next few days passed quietly. Frederick called once to check on me, a brief conversation where he asked how I was feeling, and mentioned that he and Kiana were planning a weekend trip to wine country with some friends. He didn't invite me, of course, but he seemed to expect me to be interested in the details of their itinerary. "That sounds lovely," I said when he finished describing their planned activities. "Have a wonderful time." "Thanks, Mom." "We will." "Oh. And Kiana wanted me to tell you that she hopes you're feeling better. She was really worried about you." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Kiana, who had orchestrated the furniture emergency that pulled Frederick away from my hospital bedside, was supposedly worried about my health. "Please tell her I appreciate her concern," I replied, my voice neutral. There was a pause, as if Frederick was waiting for me to say something more. When I didn't, he filled the silence with details about restaurant reservations and winery tours that I didn't particularly care to hear. The conversation ended with his usual promise to call me when they got back, a promise I no longer believed he would keep without prompting. But something was different this time. Instead of feeling disappointed or hurt by his obvious excitement about plans that didn't include me, I felt nothing at all. It was as if I had stepped outside of our dysfunctional dynamic and was observing it from a distance. Frederick was going to do what Frederick was going to do. He was going to prioritize Kiana's desires, manufacture excuses when convenient, and expect me to be endlessly understanding. That was who he had chosen to be, and I couldn't change it. But I could change how I responded to it. Tuesday morning arrived, and I dressed carefully for my appointment with Harold. I had chosen a navy blue suit that made me feel professional and confident, the same outfit I used to wear to important library board meetings when I wanted to be taken seriously. Harold's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, all dark wood and leather-bound books that gave it an air of old-fashioned respectability. He greeted me with a warm handshake and settled me into a comfortable chair across from his mahogany desk. "Now then, Anna, tell me what's been on your mind." I had rehearsed this conversation several times in my head, but sitting there in Harold's office, I found myself speaking more candidly than I had expected. "I want to change the primary beneficiary of my will from Frederick to Aaliyah Cooper. Aaliyah Wright now, I suppose. She remarried last year." Harold raised an eyebrow but didn't seem shocked. As a family attorney, he had probably seen stranger requests. That's certainly your prerogative, Anna. May I ask what's prompted this decision? I told him about the hospital incident, about the pattern of behavior I had been overlooking, about the contrast between how Aaliyah had treated me and how Kiana treated me. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a legal pad. I understand your frustration, he said when I finished. But this is a significant decision that will have lasting consequences. Have you considered discussing this with Frederick first? Sometimes these family dynamics can be worked out with honest communication. I appreciated Harold's caution, but I had already considered that option extensively. Harold, I've been having honest communication with Frederick for 2 years, and it hasn't changed anything. I've expressed my feelings. I've tried to be understanding, and I've accommodated his choices at every turn. The result is that he's learned he can treat me poorly without consequences. Harold nodded slowly. And you believe that changing your will might provide those consequences? I believe that my assets should go to someone who has shown genuine care for me, rather than someone who sees me as an obligation to be managed. Aaliyah was more of a daughter to me in 5 years than Kiana has been in 2. She deserves to benefit from that relationship. What about Frederick? Even if you're disappointed in his recent behavior, he is still your son. I had wrestled with this question for days. Despite everything, Frederick was still my offspring, the boy I had raised and loved for 35 years. But I had come to realize that love without respect wasn't really love at all. It was enabling. Frederick will inherit his father's workshop and tools, which are probably worth about $15,000. That's not nothing. But the house, the savings, the investments, those should go to someone who has earned them through their actions, not just their DNA. Harold made more notes, then looked up at me with the expression I couldn't quite read. Anna, I have to ask, is this decision being made out of anger? Because decisions made in anger often get reversed when emotions settle. I considered his question carefully. Was I angry? Disappointed, certainly. Hurt? Absolutely. But angry? No, I didn't think so. I'm not angry, Harold. If anything, I feel more clear-headed than I have in years. This isn't about punishment, it's about acknowledgement. I want my assets to go to someone who valued our relationship, not someone who took it for granted. Harold spent the next hour explaining the legal implications of my decision. I would need to update several documents, and there were tax considerations to discuss. We scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week to finalize the paperwork. As I was preparing to leave, Harold asked one final question. Have you thought about how you'll handle this with Frederick? Will you tell him about the change? I hadn't decided yet, but I was leaning toward keeping it private until it became relevant. I don't think so. Frederick has made his priorities clear through his actions. I don't see any reason to discuss mine with him. That evening, Frederick called to tell me about their wine country trip. They had visited 4 vineyards, eaten at a restaurant that was absolutely incredible, and Kiana had bought several bottles of wine to save for special occasions. It sounds like you had a wonderful time, I said, and I meant it. I was genuinely glad that Frederick had enjoyed himself. We did. You would have loved the scenery, Mom. Maybe next time we could plan a trip that includes you. A few weeks ago, that comment would have filled me with hope. The possibility of being included in their plans would have seemed like progress, a sign that maybe things were improving between us. Now I recognized it for what it was, a vague, non-committal gesture, designed to make Frederick feel like a good son without requiring any actual commitment on his part. That would be nice, I replied, but without the eager enthusiasm he was probably expecting. There was another pause, longer this time. Mom, are you okay? You sound different lately. Different? Yes, I supposed I was different. I was no longer willing to pretend that crumbs of attention were the same as genuine care. I was no longer grateful for whatever minimal consideration Frederick was willing to provide. I was no longer afraid that setting boundaries would drive him away because I was beginning to understand that someone who would leave over reasonable expectations wasn't really present to begin with. "I'm fine, Frederick. Just tired, I think." "Well, make sure you're getting enough rest, and let me know if you need anything, okay?" "I will. Enjoy the rest of your evening." After I hung up, I sat in my living room and looked around at the house. I had shared with Frederick's father for 22 years, the house where I had raised Frederick as a single mother after his father died. Every room held memories of our life together: birthday parties, Christmas mornings, homework sessions at the kitchen table, late-night conversations about his hopes and dreams. But those memories belonged to a different Frederick, one who had existed before Kiana taught him that his mother's feelings were negotiable, while his wife's desires were sacred. I wasn't trying to punish that young Frederick by changing my will. I was simply acknowledging that he no longer existed, and that the man who had replaced him had different values and priorities. The man Frederick had become didn't deserve to inherit the life that the boy Frederick had shared with me. But Aaliyah, who had cherished that life and enhanced it, did. For the first time since Frederick had walked out of my hospital room, I felt completely at peace with my decision. The following week, Frederick called to invite me to dinner. This was unusual. Typically, our interactions were either brief check-in calls or requests for help with something. An actual invitation to spend time together was rare enough that it caught my attention. "Kiana and I were thinking it might be nice to take you out to dinner this Friday," he said, his tone artificially bright. "There's a new Italian place in Oakfield that's supposed to be really good." In the past, I would have been thrilled by this invitation. I would have spent days looking forward to it, planning what to wear, hoping that maybe this dinner would mark a turning point in our relationship. I would have seen it as evidence that Frederick was finally making an effort to include me in his life. Now, I found myself wondering what had prompted this sudden gesture. Frederick didn't do anything without a reason, and spontaneous kindness toward me hadn't been characteristic of his behavior lately. "That sounds nice," I said neutrally. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion. Can't a son take his mother out to dinner just because he wants to?" There was something forced about his cheerfulness that made me suspicious, but I agreed to meet them at the restaurant on Friday evening. I arrived at Marcello's exactly on time, wearing a simple black dress that I had always felt comfortable in. Frederick and Kiana were already seated at a table near the window, and Frederick stood to hug me when I approached. "Mom, you look great. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." Kiana smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Mrs. Graham, I'm so glad you could join us. Frederick's been wanting to do this for weeks." I settled into my chair and accepted the menu from the waiter. As I looked it over, I noticed that all the prices had been removed. This was the kind of restaurant where they gave women menus without prices, assuming that someone else would be paying. It was an old-fashioned practice that had always annoyed me, but I didn't comment on it. "The veal piccata is supposed to be excellent here," Frederick said, studying his own menu. "Or if you prefer something lighter, Kiana heard the salmon is really good. Actually, I think I'll have the linguine with clam sauce," I said. "I've been craving shellfish lately." Frederick looked surprised. "Really? I've never known you to order clam sauce. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more traditional? Maybe the chicken parmesan?" I looked at my son across the table and realized that he had just revealed something important. Frederick thought he knew my food preferences, but he was completely wrong. I had been ordering clam sauce at Italian restaurants for years. It was one of my favorite dishes. But apparently, Frederick had never paid enough attention to notice. "I'm quite sure about the clam sauce," I said calmly. "I've always enjoyed it." Kiana jumped in quickly, perhaps sensing the awkwardness. "That sounds delicious. I'm going to try the seafood risotto myself." When the waiter came to take our order, Frederick ordered for all three of us, a habit that had always irritated me but that I had never challenged. Tonight, however, when he told the waiter that I would have the chicken parmesan, I spoke up. "Actually, I'll have the linguine with clam sauce, please." The waiter nodded and made the correction, but Frederick looked genuinely puzzled. "Mom, are you sure? You've never been a fan of clams." "Frederick, I've ordered clam sauce dozens of times over the years. Just because you haven't noticed doesn't mean it's not true." There was an uncomfortable silence at the table. Kiana busied herself with her water glass, and Frederick looked like he was trying to process this information. I guess I just don't remember you ordering that before." "There are probably a lot of things you don't remember about my preferences," I said matter-of-factly. "It's not entirely your fault. We haven't shared many meals together lately." Another silence. Frederick was clearly struggling with the realization that he might not know me as well as he thought he did. The conversation moved on to safer topics: the weather, local news, Kiana's job at the medical clinic. But I found myself paying attention to the small details of our interaction in a way I hadn't before. When Frederick asked if I wanted to share an appetizer, he suggested the bruschetta, which I had never particularly enjoyed. When he commented on how elegant the restaurant was, he seemed to assume I would be impressed by the white tablecloths and formal service, when in fact I found the atmosphere a bit stuffy. Most tellingly, when the conversation turned to family memories, Frederick kept bringing up events that had involved Aaliyah. He told a story about a camping trip we had taken when he and Aaliyah were first married, describing it as one of our best family vacations ever. "That was a wonderful trip," I agreed. Aaliyah was so good at organizing those outdoor activities. She made sure everyone felt included. Frederick nodded enthusiastically. "She was always great at that kind of thing. Remember how she taught you to fish that weekend? You were so proud when you caught that bass." "I still have the photo she took of me holding it," I said. She was thoughtful about capturing those moments. Kiana's smile had become noticeably strained during this exchange. She clearly wasn't comfortable with the praise being lavished on Frederick's ex-wife, but she couldn't object without seeming petty. "Well," she said finally, "it's nice that you all have such good memories together." There was something in her tone that suggested she found these good memories somewhat problematic, which confirmed what I had long suspected. Kiana saw Aaliyah as a threat, even though the divorce had been finalized for over a year. When our entrees arrived, I noticed another interesting detail. Frederick cut his veal into small, precise pieces before eating it, exactly the way Kiana cut her food. This was a new habit. Frederick had always been a somewhat messy eater who would take large bites and talk with his mouth full. But as I watched him carefully dabbing his mouth with his napkin after each bite and making sure his utensils were properly aligned between courses, I realized that Kiana had been training him in what she considered proper table manners. "Frederick, you've become quite sophisticated in your dining habits," I observed. He looked down at his plate, perhaps realizing for the first time that he was unconsciously mimicking his wife's behavior. "I guess I've just gotten more careful about these things." "Kiana's influence, I assume?" Kiana beamed. "I did suggest that it's important to have good manners, especially when we're dining out. First impressions matter so much." I nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed they do. Though I have to say, I always thought Frederick's natural informality was part of his charm." This comment seemed to land like a small bomb at the table. Frederick looked uncomfortable, caught between his wife's expectations and his mother's apparent criticism of his transformation. "Well," Kiana said with a tight smile, "we all grow and change, don't we? That's what being in a partnership is about, helping each other become better versions of ourselves." "Certainly," I agreed. "Though I suppose it depends on how you define better." The remainder of the dinner passed with carefully polite conversation, but I could feel the tension that my small acts of assertion had created. Frederick kept glancing between Kiana and me, as if he was trying to gauge whether some kind of conflict was brewing. When the check arrived, Frederick reached for it immediately, but I was faster. "Please let me handle this," I said, taking out my credit card. "It's my pleasure to treat you both." "Mom, you don't need to do that. I invited you. I insist. It's the least I can do to thank you for thinking of me." Frederick looked genuinely distressed by my insistence on paying. I realized that he had probably brought me to dinner expecting to play the role of the generous son, treating his grateful mother. My refusal to accept his gesture disrupted whatever narrative he had constructed about the evening. As we walked to our cars, Kiana thanked me effusively for dinner and mentioned that they should do this more often. Frederick seemed quieter, more thoughtful. "Mom," he said as we reached my car, "is everything okay between us? You seem different lately." There was that word again. Different. Frederick had noticed that something had changed in my behavior, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. "I'm fine, Frederick. Perhaps I'm just becoming more comfortable expressing my preferences instead of always deferring to others." He frowned slightly. "I don't think you've ever deferred to me about anything. You've always been pretty independent." This comment revealed just how little Frederick understood about our relationship dynamic. In his mind, I was the strong, independent mother who had always done exactly what she wanted. He genuinely didn't see how much I had accommodated his choices, how many times I had swallowed my disappointment, how often I had pretended to understand when his priorities didn't include me. "Perhaps you're right," I said mildly. "Drive safely home." As I drove back to my house, I reflected on the evening's revelations. Frederick didn't know my food preferences, had never noticed that I disliked formal restaurants, and was completely unaware of how much I had been deferring to his wishes over the years. More importantly, he was becoming someone else under Kiana's influence. More formal, more controlled, more concerned with appearances than authenticity. The easygoing, unpretentious man I had raised was being replaced by someone who cut his food into precise pieces and worried about proper napkin placement. I wasn't necessarily opposed to Frederick improving his table manners, but I was troubled by the realization that Kiana's idea of improvement seemed to involve erasing the qualities that had made Frederick himself. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt grateful for the conversation with Harold Goldstein the previous week. Frederick was changing, and not necessarily for the better. The man who was emerging from Kiana's influence was someone I barely recognized, someone who didn't know his own mother's favorite foods and couldn't see how much she had sacrificed for his comfort. Aaliyah had never tried to change Frederick's essential nature. She had loved him as he was, while encouraging him to be the best version of himself. There was a crucial difference between those two approaches, and the results spoke for themselves. Tonight had confirmed that I was making the right decision about my will. 3 days after our dinner at Marcello's, Frederick called with what sounded like genuine excitement in his voice. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe our evening together had reminded him of the value of our relationship. "Mom, I have great news. Kiana and I want to invite you to spend this Saturday with us. We're planning to drive up to Westfield to visit that antique mall you mentioned loving so much." I was surprised he remembered my mentioning the antique mall. It had been months ago, during one of our brief phone conversations, when I had told him about a wonderful day trip I'd taken with Daisy Clark. We had spent hours browsing through vintage furniture and collectibles, and I had found a beautiful set of Depression-era glassware that reminded me of my grandmother's dishes. "That's very thoughtful, Frederick. What brought this on?" "Well, Kiana has been feeling bad about how busy we've been lately. She thought it would be nice to do something you'd really enjoy. Plus, she's been wanting to look for some vintage pieces for our house." There it was, the real reason for the invitation. Kiana wanted to go antique shopping, and including me made it seem like a generous gesture rather than a personal errand. "What time were you thinking of leaving?" I asked. We thought we'd pick you up around 10 a.m. That would give us the whole day, and maybe we could have lunch at that little cafe you mentioned. I agreed to the plan, though I noticed that Frederick's enthusiasm seemed focused more on Kiana's interest in antiques than on spending time with me. Still, I found myself looking forward to Saturday. Maybe this could be an opportunity to rebuild some connection with my son. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made antique shopping seem like a cozy indoor activity. I dressed warmly and waited by the window for Frederick's car to arrive. At exactly 10 a.m., I saw his sedan pull into my driveway. Frederick got out to help me with my purse and umbrella, and I noticed that Kiana remained in the front passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. "Ready for our adventure?" Frederick asked cheerfully as he opened the back door for me. "Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this all week." As we drove toward Westfield, Kiana dominated the conversation from the front seat, talking excitedly about specific items she hoped to find. She was looking for a vintage vanity for their bedroom, a farmhouse-style dining table, and perhaps some antique mirrors for their living room. "Mrs. Graham," she said, turning to smile at me. "Frederick told me you have such a good eye for antiques. I'm hoping you can help me find some real treasures today." I was pleased to be consulted for my expertise, even if I suspected that Kiana's enthusiasm was primarily about getting good deals rather than genuine appreciation for vintage craftsmanship. We were about 20 minutes from Westfield when Frederick's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his expression immediately shifted to concern. "It's Lemuel," he told Kiana. "I should probably take this." He answered the phone using the car's Bluetooth system, so we could all hear the conversation. "Frederick, man, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I'm in a bind here. My truck won't start, and I have to move all my stuff out of my apartment today. The lease expires at midnight, and the landlord said if I'm not completely out by then, he's going to charge me another month's rent." Frederick immediately looked tense. "What's wrong with the truck?" "I don't know, but it's completely dead. I called AAA, but they can't get here until this afternoon, and I need to be out of here in the next few hours. I was wondering, could I possibly borrow your truck? I know it's a huge favor to ask." I felt my heart sink as I watched Frederick's face. I could practically see him calculating whether he could help his friend without completely ruining our day. "Lemuel, I'm actually in the middle of something with my mom and Kiana. We're on our way to—" "Frederick," Kiana interrupted, her voice sharp with urgency. "Lemuel really needs help. You know how difficult his landlord has been." I stared at her in amazement. Kiana, who had supposedly planned this outing as a thoughtful gesture toward me, was now encouraging Frederick to abandon it for his friend's convenience. "I know, but we promised Mom we'd take her to Westfield today. Mrs. Graham understands. That emergency's come up, don't you?" Kiana turned to look at me with an expression that managed to be both sweet and challenging. "Lemuel is practically family." The parallel to the hospital incident was so obvious that I almost laughed. Once again, someone else's crisis was being positioned as more important than our plans, and once again, I was being expected to be understanding about it. But this time, instead of immediately agreeing to be accommodating, I remained silent. Frederick glanced at me in the rearview mirror, clearly hoping I would give him permission to help his friend. When I didn't speak, he looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Lemuel, let me call you back in just a minute, okay?" After he hung up, the car was filled with tense silence. "So," Frederick said finally, "what do you think, Mom? This is really important for Lemuel. If he has to pay another month's rent, it'll be a serious financial hardship." I considered my response carefully. In the past, I would have immediately said it was fine, that we could reschedule our trip, that helping friends was more important than antique shopping. I would have played the role of the understanding mother who never complained when her plans were disrupted. But I was tired of that role. "Frederick," I said calmly, "this is the second time in 2 weeks that someone else's emergency has taken priority over our time together. I'm beginning to see a pattern. Kiana turned around to face me fully, her expression no longer sweet. Mrs. Graham, surely you're not suggesting that Frederick should ignore a friend in need? I'm suggesting that there might be other solutions to Lemuel's problem that don't involve canceling our plans. For instance, Frederick could loan him the truck later this afternoon, after we return from Westfield. But then it might be too late. Kiana protested. His lease expires at midnight. A truck can move an apartment's worth of belongings in a few hours, I replied evenly. Unless Lemuel has been procrastinating about his move, there should be plenty of time to help him after our trip. Frederick looked genuinely torn. This was probably the first time I had ever objected to one of his emergency rescues, and he didn't seem to know how to handle it. Mom, I understand you're disappointed, but Lemuel is really in a tight spot here. And I'm really looking forward to spending time with my son, I said. But apparently that's less important than Lemuel's poor planning. The silence that followed was deafening. Frederick stared at the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Kiana had turned back around in her seat and was staring out the passenger window with obvious irritation. Finally, Frederick made his decision. Mom, I'm really sorry, but I think we need to go help Lemuel. We can do the antique trip another time. Without waiting for my response, he called Lemuel back and told him they were turning around to come help with the move. As Frederick made a U-turn to head back toward town, I felt a familiar sense of resignation, but also something else: validation. Frederick had just proven, once again, that my feelings and our plans would always be secondary to whatever crisis emerged from his social circle. But this time, instead of pretending to understand, I had clearly stated my objection. Frederick had heard exactly how I felt about his choice, and he had made it anyway. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said as we drove back toward my house. "I know you were looking forward to today." "Yes, I was," I replied simply. "We'll definitely reschedule. Soon. Maybe next weekend." I didn't respond to that suggestion because we both knew it was meaningless. There would always be another emergency, another friend in need, another crisis that required Frederick's immediate attention. When we reached my house, Frederick got out to walk me to my door, his face creased with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Mom, I really am sorry about today. I know this is disappointing." I looked at my son, this 35-year-old man who still couldn't prioritize his relationships or honor his commitments when something more interesting came along. "Frederick," I said quietly, "I want you to understand something. This isn't about antique shopping. This is about the fact that you've shown me, repeatedly, that I'm not a priority in your life. Today just confirmed what I already knew." He looked stricken. "That's not true, Mom. You're very important to me. If that were true, you would occasionally choose me over other people's convenience. But in 2 years of marriage to Kiana, I can't think of a single time when you've done that." Frederick opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to realize he couldn't think of a counterexample. "I'll make this up to you," he said finally. "No, Frederick, you won't. Because making it up to me would require acknowledging that what you did was wrong, and you don't believe it was wrong. You believe you did the right thing by helping a friend in need." I turned toward my front door, then paused. "The problem is that you never seem to see me as someone who might need help, or consideration, or simply the basic respect of having plans honored." As I closed my door behind me, I felt the same clarity I had experienced after the hospital incident. Frederick had shown me exactly who he was, again. He was someone who would always find a way to justify putting my needs last, and who expected me to be grateful for whatever attention he could spare. But I was done being grateful for scraps, and I was done pretending to understand behavior that was fundamentally disrespectful. My appointment with Harold to finalize the will changes was scheduled for Tuesday. After today, I had no doubts about moving forward with that plan. Tuesday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and brilliant sunshine, the kind of weather that made everything seem possible. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one that made me feel professional and confident, and drove to Harold's office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Harold greeted me warmly and led me to his conference room, where several documents were already laid out on the polished wooden table. He had clearly spent considerable time preparing for our meeting. "Anna, I've drafted everything according to your specifications," he said, settling into his chair across from me. "Before we proceed, I want to make sure you've had time to think this through completely. Once these documents are signed and witnessed, your estate will pass primarily to Aaliyah Wright, with only the workshop and tools going to Frederick. Are you certain this is what you want?" I looked down at the papers before me, thinking about the weekend's events and the long pattern of behavior they represented. "Harold, I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He nodded and began walking me through each document. The new will was comprehensive, detailing not just the distribution of my assets, but also my wishes for my funeral arrangements and the handling of my personal effects. I had specified that my jewelry should go to Aaliyah, along with the family photos and keepsakes that Frederick had never shown any interest in preserving. "There's one additional matter we should discuss," Harold said as we neared the end of the paperwork. "Have you considered writing a letter to accompany the will? Something that explains your reasoning?" I had thought about this extensively. Part of me wanted Frederick to understand why I had made this choice, to recognize the pattern of behavior that had led to this moment. But another part of me questioned whether such a letter would serve any purpose beyond making me feel better. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "In my experience, these letters can be helpful for family members trying to understand the deceased's wishes. They can prevent speculation and provide closure, but they can also create additional hurt feelings if they're perceived as vindictive." Considered this carefully. My goal wasn't to hurt Frederick, but rather to ensure that my assets went to someone who had valued our relationship. Still, I could see the wisdom in explaining my reasoning. "I think I would like to write a letter," I decided, not to justify my decision, but to help Frederick understand the consequences of his choices. Harold provided me with paper and left me alone in the conference room to write. I sat for several minutes, thinking about what I wanted to say, before beginning to write by hand. "Dear Frederick, if you are reading this letter, it means I am gone, and you have learned about the changes I made to my will. I imagine you are shocked, and perhaps angry about my decision to leave the majority of my estate to Aaliyah. I want you to understand that this choice was not made in anger or spite, but rather as a reflection of the relationships that brought meaning to my life. Over the past 2 years, I watched our relationship change in ways that caused me great sadness. I found myself consistently being treated as secondary to Kiana's needs and desires, and I realized that you had come to see my feelings as negotiable while viewing hers as sacred. The hospital incident was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern where my plans, my feelings, and my need for your attention were repeatedly sacrificed for what you deemed more pressing concerns. Each time I expressed disappointment, you had an explanation. Each time I hoped things would change, they remained the same. I tried to be the understanding mother who never complained, who always accommodated your choices, who pretended that crumbs of attention were sufficient. But in doing so, I enabled behavior that ultimately devalued our relationship. Aaliyah, during the 5 years she was part of our family, showed me what it meant to be genuinely valued. She encouraged your relationship with me, remembered what was important to me, and treated me as someone worthy of consideration and respect. She understood that loving you meant honoring the people who had shaped your life. This inheritance is not a punishment for you, Frederick. It is recognition for someone who made my life richer through her kindness and thoughtfulness. The workshop and tools were your father's, and they rightfully belong to you. But the life I built after his death, the home, the savings, the small treasures I accumulated, those should go to someone who cherished what they represented. I hope someday you will understand that love without respect is not really love at all. I hope you will learn to value the people in your life before it is too late to show them how much they mean to you. I have loved you every day of your life, and that love will continue even though I am gone. But love, I have learned, must be expressed through actions, not just words. With eternal love and hope for your future happiness, your mother, Anna. When I finished writing, I read the letter several times, making small edits. I wanted the tone to be loving but honest, explanatory, rather than accusatory. When I was satisfied with the content, I folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. Harold reviewed the letter and nodded approvingly. This strikes exactly the right tone, Anna. It explains your reasoning without being vindictive. We spent the next hour finalizing all the paperwork. Harold had arranged for 2 witnesses, his secretary and a notary public, to validate the documents. As I signed my name to each page, I felt a profound sense of relief, as if I was finally taking control of my own story. "There's one more thing," I said as we prepared to conclude our meeting. "I'd like to make a small change to my banking arrangements." I explained that I wanted to add Aaliyah as a beneficiary to my savings accounts and certificates of deposit. Harold noted that this would allow those assets to transfer to her immediately upon my death without going through probate. "Are you planning to tell Aaliyah about these arrangements?" he asked. "Not yet. I don't want her to feel burdened by this knowledge or to think that I expect anything from her in return. This is simply my way of ensuring that someone who showed me genuine kindness will benefit from it." As I drove home from Harold's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. For too long, I had been waiting for Frederick to change, hoping that he would recognize the value of our relationship and begin treating it with the respect it deserved. But I had finally accepted that I couldn't control Frederick's choices. I could only control my own responses to them. And my response was to ensure that my life's work would benefit someone who had genuinely appreciated it. That evening, I called Aaliyah for the first time since her remarriage to Ronald Wright. I had been hesitant to reach out, unsure whether she would want to maintain contact given the complicated history between our families. "Mrs. Graham," Aaliyah's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "What a wonderful surprise. How are you feeling? Frederick mentioned you had a health scare recently." I was touched that she had remembered, and that she had taken the time to ask Frederick about my well-being, even though they were no longer married. "I'm much better, thank you for asking. I was calling because I wanted to hear about your new life." "Frederick told me you remarried?" "Yes. Ronald is wonderful. He's a retired teacher and he treats me like absolute royalty. We're very happy." I could hear the joy in her voice, and it made my heart glad. Aaliyah deserved someone who would cherish her the way she had cherished others. "I'm so pleased for you, dear. You deserve all the happiness in the world." We talked for nearly an hour, catching up on her work, her new marriage, and her plans for the holidays. She asked about my health, my activities, and whether I was taking care of myself properly. It was the kind of conversation I used to have with Frederick: genuine interest, mutual care, real connection. "Mrs. Graham," she said, as our conversation was winding down, "I hope you know that even though Frederick and I are divorced, you will always be special to me. Those 5 years when I was part of your family were some of the happiest of my life." Tears came to my eyes as I listened to her words. This young woman, who owed me nothing and had every reason to avoid complications with her ex-husband's family, was telling me that our relationship had mattered to her. "Aaliyah, that means more to me than you could possibly know." After we hung up, I sat in my living room and looked around at the life I had built. The furniture I had chosen, the books I had collected, the photographs that captured decades of memories, all of it would soon belong to someone who would value it not for its monetary worth, but for what it represented. Frederick would get his father's tools and the workshop where so many of our family projects had been completed. Those items held memories of the father he had lost too young. and they rightfully belonged to him. But everything else, the home where I had raised him, the savings I had accumulated through careful planning, the small treasures that marked the milestones of my life, would go to someone who understood their true value. For the first time in 2 years, I fell asleep feeling completely at peace with my decisions. I had stopped waiting for Frederick to change and had instead taken control of my own life and legacy. The transformation was complete. 3 weeks after finalizing my will, I received an unexpected phone call from Frederick. His voice carried an unusual note of urgency that immediately caught my attention. "Mom, I need to ask you for a favor. It's pretty important." I settled into my favorite armchair and waited for him to explain. Over the years, Frederick's requests for favors had ranged from borrowing money to asking me to watch their house while they traveled. I was curious to see what he needed this time. "Kiana and I are looking at buying a house," he continued, "and we need someone to co-sign the mortgage. Our credit is good, but we don't quite have enough for the down payment they're requiring, and the lender wants additional security." I was quiet for a moment, processing this request. Frederick was asking me to put my financial stability at risk, to help him and Kiana purchase a home, the same Kiana who had systematically worked to exclude me from their lives. "What kind of financial commitment are we talking about?" I asked. "Well, the house is listed at $450,000. We have about $30,000 saved, but they want 20% down, which is $90,000. So we need to come up with another $60,000. "And you want me to co-sign for a loan of that size?" "Not exactly. We were hoping you might consider lending us the $60,000 for the down payment, and then we'd pay you back over time. But we'd also need you to co-sign the main mortgage as additional security for the bank." I was astounded by the scope of what he was asking. Frederick wanted me to lend them $60,000, a significant portion of my life savings, and also put my own home and financial security at risk by co-signing their mortgage. "Frederick, that's a substantial amount of money and a significant financial risk. Have you considered other options?" "We've looked into everything, Mom. This house is perfect for us. It's in exactly the neighborhood we want, and the seller is motivated to close quickly. But we need to act fast, or we'll lose it to another buyer." There was something familiar about the urgency in his voice, the sense that immediate action was required to solve a crisis. It reminded me of all the times he had needed to abandon our plans for Kiana's emergencies. "When would you need an answer?" I asked. "Well, that's the thing. We're supposed to give the seller our final offer tomorrow morning. I know it's short notice, but we just found out about the cosigner requirement yesterday." Of course they did. Once again, Frederick was presenting me with a situation that required immediate decision-making, with no time for careful consideration or consultation with my own financial advisor. "Frederick, this is a major financial decision. I can't commit to something this significant overnight." There was a pause, and I could hear him talking to someone in the background, presumably Kiana. "Mom, I understand it's a big ask, but this house is really important to us. It's our chance to finally have the space we need to start a family and build our future together." The mention of starting a family was clearly intended to tug at my heartstrings, to make me feel like I would be contributing to my potential future grandchildren's welfare. But I noticed that this was the first time Frederick had mentioned anything about family planning to me directly. "Have you spoken to Harold Goldstein about the legal implications of this arrangement?" I asked. "Harold? Why would we need to involve lawyers? This would just be a family loan." Frederick's casual dismissal of legal protections revealed how little thought he had given to the complexity of what he was asking. A $60,000 loan with mortgage co-signing wasn't a simple family favor. It was a major financial transaction that could affect my security for the rest of my life. "Frederick, any loan of this size should involve proper documentation and legal protections for everyone involved. But Mom, we're family. We don't need all that formal paperwork." Between us, I almost laughed at the irony. Frederick, who had spent 2 years treating me like a peripheral figure in his life, was now appealing to family loyalty when he needed something significant from me. "Let me ask you something," I said calmly. "When was the last time you included me in a major decision you and Kiana were making?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're asking me to make a major financial commitment to support your house purchase, but you didn't consult me when you were looking at houses, didn't ask for my input on neighborhoods or price ranges, and didn't mention your family planning timeline until you needed my money." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you'd be interested in those details. But you think I'd be interested in risking my financial security to support decisions I wasn't included in making?" "Mom, that's not fair. We're asking for your help because we trust you and because you're family. Frederick, for the past 2 years, you've shown me that I'm family when you need something from me, but not when it comes to sharing your life, honoring our plans, or prioritizing our relationship." I could hear Kiana's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. Frederick's tone became slightly defensive. "I don't think that's true, Mom. We invited you to dinner just a few weeks ago." "Yes, and then you canceled our weekend plans 3 days later to help Lemuel move. One dinner doesn't erase a pattern of behavior. That was different. Lemuel was in a real bind, and I was looking forward to spending time with my son. But somehow his needs were more important than mine." Frederick sighed heavily. "Mom, I feel like you're being unfair. I'm a good son. I check on you. I take you to dinner. I help you when you need things." This was fascinating. In Frederick's mind, he was already a devoted son who deserved my financial support. He had somehow convinced himself that his minimal efforts constituted adequate attention to our relationship. "Frederick, when was the last time you helped me with something?" "What do you mean? I help you all the time." "Give me a specific example from the past 6 months." There was a long silence. I could practically hear him searching his memory for instances of assistance or support he had provided. "Well, I drove you home from the hospital after your chest pains. You drove me home after abandoning me at the hospital to help Kiana move furniture. That's not... yes, but I did come back for you." "Frederick, can you think of a single time in the past 6 months when you prioritized my needs over Kiana's convenience?" Another silence. This one stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Mom, I don't think this conversation is productive. The question is whether you're willing to help us with this house." I was struck by how quickly Frederick had shifted away from examining his own behavior and back to his request for money. He didn't want to acknowledge the pattern I was pointing out, because doing so would undermine his sense of entitlement to my financial support. "Frederick, I need time to think about this decision and consult with my financial advisor. I can't give you an answer by tomorrow morning. But Mom, if we don't make this offer tomorrow, we'll lose the house." "Then you'll lose the house. That's the consequence of asking for a major favor with insufficient notice." I could hear Kiana's voice becoming more animated in the background, though Frederick was clearly trying to muffle the sound. "Look, Mom, Kiana is really upset about this. She was counting on your help." "Kiana was counting on my help for a decision I knew nothing about until today?" We thought that because you care about our future, you'd want to support this opportunity." The presumption was breathtaking. Frederick and Kiana had made plans that depended on my financial support without consulting me, and now they were upset that I wasn't immediately agreeing to their timeline. "Frederick, let me be very clear about something. The fact that I love you doesn't mean I'm obligated to risk my financial security for decisions you make without including me." "So you're saying no?" "I'm saying I need time to make a responsible decision about a major financial commitment. If that means you lose this particular house, then you'll need to find another one." The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This one felt charged with frustration and disbelief. "I can't believe you're being this difficult about helping your own son." And there it was, the accusation I had been expecting. Because I wasn't immediately agreeing to his demands, I was being difficult. Because I wanted time to consider the implications of a $60,000 loan, I was somehow failing as a mother. Frederick, I've never been difficult about helping you, but I've also never been asked to risk my life savings for a house purchase I knew nothing about until today. Fine, he said, his voice tight with anger. We'll figure something else out. I think that would be wise. After he hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time, marveling at what had just occurred. Frederick had called expecting me to immediately agree to a major financial commitment, had become defensive when I questioned his treatment of me, and had ultimately gotten angry when I refused to operate on his timeline. The entire conversation had perfectly illustrated the dynamic that had prompted my decision to change my will. Frederick saw me as a resource to be utilized when convenient, not as a person whose feelings and financial security deserved consideration. For the first time in our relationship, I had refused to accommodate his unreasonable demands, and his response had been anger rather than reflection. The power dynamic between us had completely shifted, and Frederick clearly didn't know how to handle it. I picked up my phone and called Harold Goldstein to discuss the legal implications of what Frederick had asked for. As I expected, Harold confirmed that such an arrangement would put my own assets at significant risk and advised against it without extensive legal protections. But more importantly, the conversation had clarified something for me. Frederick still saw me as the accommodating mother who would sacrifice her own interests for his convenience. He was about to learn that person no longer existed. For 3 days after our phone conversation about the house loan, I heard nothing from Frederick. I suspected he and Kiana were exploring other options for financing their home purchase, and I was perfectly content to let them handle their own affairs without my involvement. On Thursday evening, however, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Frederick standing on my front porch, alone. His expression was serious, and he was carrying what appeared to be a manila folder. I opened the door and invited him in, noting that he seemed more subdued than usual. "Hello, Frederick. This is unexpected. Hi, Mom. I was hoping we could talk about our conversation the other day. I think there may have been some misunderstandings." I led him to the living room and offered him something to drink, which he declined. He sat down across from me and placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, "and I realize I may not have explained the situation clearly. I brought some paperwork to show you exactly what we're looking at with this house purchase." He opened the folder and spread out several documents, what appeared to be real estate listings, mortgage pre-approval letters, and financial calculations. Everything was neatly organized and annotated with colored tabs. "This is the house we want to buy," he said, pointing to a listing with professional photographs. "As you can see, it's in Maple Heights, which has excellent schools and property values that have been steadily increasing. We're not just asking you to help us buy a house, we're asking you to help us make a smart investment." I looked at the listing politely but didn't comment. Frederick continued his presentation with the enthusiasm of a salesperson. "And here," he said, producing a spreadsheet, "are the numbers. Based on current market trends, this house should appreciate by at least 5% annually. So your $60,000 loan would actually be helping us build equity that benefits the whole family." The phrase "benefits the whole family" was clearly intended to suggest that I would somehow share in the profits of their real estate investment, though Frederick hadn't actually offered any specific arrangement to that effect. "I've also been talking to Harold Goldstein," he continued, "and he helped me draft this promissory note that would formalize our loan agreement and protect both parties." He handed me a document that appeared professionally prepared. I glanced through it and saw that it specified repayment terms of $500 per month over 10 years, with interest at 3% annually. As you can see, this isn't just a casual family loan. We're prepared to make this a formal business arrangement with regular payments and legal documentation. I set the promissory note aside and looked at my son. "Frederick, this is all very thorough. But it doesn't address my primary concern, which is... My primary concern is that you're asking me to make a major financial commitment to support your life plans, while you've consistently shown that my plans and feelings are expendable when they conflict with your convenience. Frederick's confident expression faltered slightly. Mom, I thought we had moved past that. I've been trying to spend more time with you. You took me to dinner once, then canceled our weekend plans 3 days later. That was an emergency situation with Lemuel. Frederick, do you see the pattern here? Every time you want something from me, whether it's understanding about canceled plans or financial support for a house, you frame it as something I should want to provide because I love you. But when I want something from you, like consistent consideration or honored commitments, there's always a reason why that's not possible. Frederick shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with this line of discussion. I don't think that's a fair characterization of our relationship. Let me ask you something. In all your planning for this house purchase, did you ever consider whether I might want to be involved in the decision-making process? What do you mean? I mean, did you think about asking for my input on neighborhoods, or inviting me to look at houses with you, or discussing your timeline for starting a family? Or did you only think to include me when you needed my money? Frederick was quiet for a moment. I guess I didn't think you'd be interested in those details. But you think I'd be interested in risking my financial security for decisions I wasn't included in making? That's different. We're asking for your help because we value your support. Frederick, you're asking for my money because you need my money. That's not the same as valuing my support. He looked down at the document spread across the coffee table, then back at me. Mom, I feel like nothing I say is going to be good. Enough for you. This was a classic deflection technique, repositioning himself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations, rather than acknowledging the validity of my concerns. Frederick, I'm not asking you to say anything. I'm asking you to examine your behavior and consider whether you're treating me with the respect and consideration that would justify such a significant request. I do respect you, Mom. I love you. I believe you love me. But love without consistent respect and consideration isn't enough to build the kind of relationship that would make me comfortable with this level of financial entanglement. Frederick pulled out another document from his folder. What if we modified the terms? We could pay you back faster or offer a higher interest rate. I realized that Frederick fundamentally didn't understand what this conversation was about. He thought my reluctance was about the financial terms of the loan, when it was actually about the relationship dynamic that had led to his request. Frederick, this isn't about interest rates or repayment schedules. This is about the fact that you've spent 2 years showing me that I'm not a priority in your life, and now you're asking me to prioritize your needs in a major way. But Mom, this house is really important to our future. Kiana and I want to start a family, and we need more space. We're not getting any younger. There it was again, the appeal to my presumed desire for grandchildren, as if my willingness to risk my financial security should be motivated by their reproductive timeline. Frederick, your family planning is your responsibility, not mine. I'm not obligated to fund your house purchase because you've decided you want children. His face flushed slightly. I can't believe you're being so selfish about this. The accusation hung in the air between us. Frederick had just called me selfish for refusing to lend him $60,000 and co-sign his mortgage. Selfish, I repeated calmly. That's an interesting choice of words from someone who abandoned his mother in a hospital to help his wife move furniture. That's not fair. That was months ago, and it was a genuine emergency. Frederick, do you know what a genuine emergency is? A genuine emergency is when your 73-year-old mother thinks she's having a heart attack and needs her son to stay with her in the hospital. The doctor said you were fine. The doctor said I hadn't had a heart attack. She also said I needed additional tests to rule out underlying cardiac issues. But you didn't stay to hear that part because you were too busy helping Kiana with her furniture crisis. Frederick stood up abruptly, clearly frustrated. I don't know what you want from me, Mom. I've apologized for that day. I've tried to make it up to you. What more can I do? You can stop asking me to fund your life while treating my feelings as disposable. So that's it? You're just going to refuse to help us? I looked at my son, this 35-year-old man, who still couldn't understand that relationships require consistent investment, not just crisis management and financial requests. Frederick, I want you to be happy. I want you and Kiana to have a wonderful life together. But I'm not going to risk my financial security to support that life when you've made it clear that my emotional security doesn't matter to you. That's not true. You do matter to me. Then show me, not with a promissory note or a spreadsheet, but with your actions. Honor our plans. Include me in your decisions. Stop treating my feelings as less important than everyone else's convenience. Frederick gathered up his documents with sharp, angry movements. Fine, we'll figure something else out. I hope you do. He headed toward the door, then turned back. Mom, I hope someday you'll realize that families are supposed to support each other. I agree completely, I said. Families are supposed to support each other, consistently, not just when they need money. After Frederick left, I sat in my living room feeling surprisingly calm. He had just deployed every manipulation technique in his arsenal: emotional appeals, financial projections, legal documentation, guilt, and finally accusation. And I had remained unmoved. The Frederick who had raised himself with my help for 23 years would never have called me selfish for refusing an unreasonable request. But the Frederick who had emerged from Kiana's influence was someone who felt entitled to my resources while offering nothing in return. I thought about Aaliyah and how she would have handled a similar situation. She would have included me in the house hunting process, valued my input, and understood that asking for financial support required first demonstrating consistent care and consideration. But more importantly, Aaliyah would never have asked me to risk my security for her convenience because she genuinely cared about my well-being. That night, I called Harold Goldstein to let him know that Frederick had approached him about drafting a promissory note. I told him I'd be happy to help, Harold said, but I also advised him that such an arrangement would be inadvisable without significant relationship repair work first. What did he say to that? He seemed surprised that I would consider the personal relationship relevant to a business transaction. I wasn't surprised. Frederick had become someone who could compartmentalize his financial needs from his relational behavior, expecting me to fund his life regardless of how he treated me. But I was no longer the accommodating mother who would sacrifice her own interests for his convenience. That person was gone forever. 6 months passed after Frederick's failed attempt to secure my financial support for his house purchase. During that time, our interactions became increasingly infrequent and superficial. He would call occasionally with brief updates about his life, but the pretense of maintaining a close relationship had largely disappeared. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Frederick and Kiana had ultimately found another house in a less expensive neighborhood, financing it through a conventional mortgage without family assistance. I was genuinely glad they had found a solution that didn't require my involvement. More importantly, those 6 months gave me the opportunity to build a life that wasn't centered around waiting for Frederick's attention or accommodating his schedule. I reconnected with old friends, joined a book club at the library, and even took a watercolor painting class at the community center. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my own life rather than existing in the margins of someone else's. The transformation became most clear to me during a conversation with Daisy Clark over lunch one afternoon. We were discussing our respective families when she made an observation that stopped me cold. Anna, I have to tell you something. You seem so much happier lately, more relaxed, more yourself. I was worried about you for a while there. You seemed like you were always walking on eggshells, waiting for something. She was right. I had been waiting for Frederick to call, waiting for plans that might get canceled. waiting to see if I would be included in family decisions or left out again. I had structured my entire life around Frederick's unpredictable attention, and in doing so, I had lost myself. I think I finally stopped trying to control things I couldn't control, I told her. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that would test just how complete my transformation had been. "Mrs. Graham, this is Dr. Patterson from Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling because your son Frederick has been in an accident." My heart immediately began racing. Despite everything that had happened between us, Frederick was still my son, and the thought of him being seriously injured filled me with terror. "What kind of accident? Is he all right?" "He was in a car collision this afternoon. He has a concussion and some broken ribs, but he's stable. He's been asking for you." I grabbed my purse and keys and drove to the hospital immediately, my mind filled with worst-case scenarios. Whatever our relationship issues had been, they seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of losing him. When I arrived at Frederick's room, I found him awake but groggy, with Kiana sitting beside his bed. His face was bruised, and he had bandages around his torso, but he was clearly going to be fine. "Mom," he said when he saw me, his voice hoarse. "You came?" "Of course I came, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" We talked for a few minutes about his injuries and the accident. Someone had run a red light and hit his car on the driver's side. The doctors wanted to keep him overnight for observation, but he would be able to go home the next day. After about an hour, Kiana stepped out to make some phone calls, leaving Frederick and me alone. "Mom," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about a lot of things while I've been lying here. About our relationship, about the things you said when I asked for the loan." I waited for him to continue. "I think maybe you were right about some of that stuff. I haven't been the best son lately." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of his behavior that I had ever heard from him. "Frederick, I'm just glad you're okay. We don't need to discuss all that now." "No, I think we do." I realized something when I woke up here. The first person I wanted to see was you, not because I needed anything from you, but because you're my mom and I love you. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. This was the Frederick I remembered, the young man who had once valued our relationship for its own sake, not just for what it could provide him. "I love you too, sweetheart. I always have. I want to do better, Mom. I want us to have a real relationship again, not just phone calls when I need something." Over the following months, Frederick seemed to make genuine efforts to rebuild our connection. He called more frequently, included me in some of his and Kiana's social plans, and even took me to lunch occasionally without needing a favor in return. But something fundamental had changed in me during those months of distance and reflection. While I appreciated Frederick's efforts and was glad to have a more positive relationship with him, I no longer needed his approval or attention to feel complete. I had discovered that my life had value and meaning independent of my role as his mother. I had friends who enjoyed my company, activities that brought me fulfillment, and a sense of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between loving someone and enabling their poor behavior. I could love Frederick deeply while still maintaining boundaries and expectations for how I deserved to be treated. The will remained unchanged, not because I was holding a grudge or trying to punish Frederick for his past behavior, but because I had made a thoughtful decision about how my life's work should be distributed. Aaliyah had earned my estate through years of genuine care and consideration, while Frederick would inherit his father's tools and workshop, a meaningful legacy that honored his connection to his father. I never told Frederick about the will changes, and I never felt the need to. My decision wasn't about him. It was about recognizing and rewarding the relationships that had truly enriched my life. As I write this story, I'm sitting in my garden on a beautiful spring morning, surrounded by the flowers I planted with my own hands and the life I built through my own choices. I'm no longer waiting for anyone's approval or accommodation. I'm simply living. That's my story. I hope it reminds you that it's never too late to reclaim your worth, set boundaries, and choose to honor the people who truly honor you in return. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone's poor treatment of you. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to build a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's whims. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I'll be back tomorrow with another story about finding strength in unexpected places. See you then. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.